I was in the middle of a client call discussing HVAC layouts for a retail renovation when my phone buzzed on the table. I almost ignored it until I saw the name, Mom. The text preview was short. "Is that all your ability amounts to? Stop embarrassing us." No greeting, no explanation, just that. For a second, I thought maybe she'd sent it to the wrong person. I stared at the words, waiting for a follow-up. Nothing. The call continued in my ear. Somebody talking about skylight dimensions, but all I could hear was the blood rushing through my head. For 6 years, I'd been sending my parents $3,800 every month, like clockwork. That money kept the lights on in their condo, kept the mortgage current, kept their lives comfortable while I ate ramen and worked nights sketching client proposals. And now I was embarrassing them? My thumb hovered over the reply box. I could have begged for clarification, demanded an apology, sent a paragraph explaining everything I'd done for them. But none of it felt right. Something in me, some quiet, exhausted part, finally went still. So I typed one word, noted, and hit send. Then, without even thinking, I opened my banking app. The screen glowed cold and blue. I scrolled to the automatic transfer labeled Harper condo, the same one I'd created 6 years ago, the one that drained nearly half my income every month, and I pressed cancel. The confirmation window popped up. "Are you sure you want to stop this recurring payment?" Yes, I was sure. When I hit confirm, it felt like oxygen returned to my lungs for the first time in years. The sound of my client's voice faded into white noise. I hung up, leaned back in my chair, and just stared out the window. Snow was starting to fall over Southbend, coating the world in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just breathed. For the first time, I wasn't the dependable daughter, the safety net, the problem solver. I was just Ivy Harper, 34, freelance architect, human being. 2 days later, the panic started. An unknown number called twice in a row. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, my phone dinged. "Ms. Harper, this is Quincy, your parents' attorney. We have an urgent matter. Please call me back immediately." His voice shook on the recording. That's when I knew whatever game my parents were playing had just turned against them. I didn't call back right away. Instead, I made tea, sat on my couch, and stared at the condensation running down the window. 6 years. 6 years of wiring nearly $4,000 every month. 6 years of watching my own life shrink so theirs could stay afloat. 6 years of convincing myself that family meant sacrifice, that respect could be earned if I just gave enough. I remembered how it started, how desperate my parents had been, how I'd felt like a savior when I said, "I'll handle it." Back then, I thought that promise would make me part of something solid, something grateful, something unbreakable. But over time, their gratitude had faded into expectation. My name turned into a $sign. I stopped being their daughter and became their funding source. Now one text had snapped whatever illusion was left. I re-listened to the voicemail once more, the lawyer's trembling voice, the urgency. "We have an urgent matter." I almost laughed. 6 years of quiet obedience, and the moment I stopped paying, it's suddenly an emergency. Outside, the snow thickened. The city moved slower, softer, muffled under white. I imagined my parents sitting in that condo, the same one my money had saved 100 times, realizing the bank wasn't getting paid anymore. Maybe Dad was pacing the living room. Maybe Mom was crying again, dabbing at her eyes the same way she did when they first told me they were 4 months behind. I used to rush to fix things. That was my role, the fixer, the dependable one. But this time I didn't move. I just watched the snow fall and let silence do the talking. Something deep inside me, the same part that once believed their promises, knew the truth. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because the money stopped. And this time I wasn't going to save them. Whatever storm was coming, it wasn't mine to stop anymore. The voicemail kept replaying in my head. "Ms. Harper, we have an urgent matter." I smiled faintly and whispered to no one, "Yeah, I bet you do." Then I turned off my phone, finished my tea, and opened an old sketchbook from college. On the first blank page, I drew a single line, straight, clean, and final, because that's what it felt like, the end of one story, and the quiet, dangerous beginning of another. 6 years earlier, I was sitting in my cramped studio apartment, surrounded by half-finished blueprints and instant noodle cups, when an email notification popped up. Subject: Congratulations, Ivy Harper. Lead architect offer. For a second I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened the attachment, the numbers made my hands shake. My pay had doubled overnight. After years of freelance scraps and underpaid drafting gigs, someone was finally trusting me with a full-scale downtown redesign project. I remember sitting there, barefoot on the tile, staring at my tiny reflection in the laptop screen. Rent was cheap, life was simple. I could finally breathe. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' condo for our usual family dinner. Snow was melting off the eaves, and the driveway looked the same as it always did. The cracks I'd chalked hopscotch on as a kid, the oak tree my brother Gage used to climb. The second I walked in, though, I felt something was off. Dad sat at the table, poking his mashed potatoes like they were the enemy. Mom had that tissue pressed to her nose. The universal sign something was wrong. Did something happen? I asked, setting down the grocery bags. She looked up, eyes red. The bank sent the final notice. Her voice cracked. We're 4 months behind. They're starting foreclosure next week. Dad pushed a crumpled letter toward me. The numbers blurred for a second before I understood them. Adjustable rate, missed payments, balloon interest. I glanced at Dad. His security guard job barely paid the bills. Mom's part-time retail hours were unpredictable. And Gage was chasing his next big idea, which usually meant another failed side hustle. The condo wasn't just a building. It was the backdrop of my entire childhood. Birthdays, scraped knees, graduation photos on the mantel. The thought of strangers boxing up our memories made my throat tighten. How much do you owe? I finally asked. Mom whispered the number. I did the math in my head. My new salary could cover it, barely, but it meant giving up almost everything else. Savings, travel plans, maybe even a chance at buying my own place. Still, looking at them sitting there, scared, small, and defeated, I didn't even hesitate. I'll handle it, I said quietly. Their heads snapped up. What do you mean? Mom blinked through tears. I'll set up an automatic transfer, every month on the 1st. The bank will get paid directly from me. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom stood, came around the table, and hugged me so tight my ribs ached. You're our angel, Ivy. Dad just nodded, eyes shining. We'll make it up to you, I promise. I believed them. That night I went home, logged into my account, and created a new recurring payment. Harper condo, $3,800, first of every month. The next morning I packed instant noodles for lunch and felt proud, like maybe this was what adulthood meant, taking care of the people who raised you. For the first few months it felt good. My parents called after each payment. Mom sent heart emojis in every text. Dad even left me a rare voicemail once. Appreciate you, kid. At family dinners, they started calling me our rock. Neighbors complimented them on how well their daughter turned out. I wore that pride like armor. When my friends asked why I couldn't go on weekend trips or buy new furniture, I smiled and said, responsibilities. They called me disciplined, focused, mature. But somewhere around the 6-month mark, something shifted. The thank yous got shorter. The texts turned into reminders. Mortgage due soon, sweetheart. Don't forget the transfer. By the end of the first year, gratitude had been replaced by expectation. Still, I told myself it was fine. It was family. Families depended on each other. Then came Gage. He showed up one evening, all grins and caffeine energy, talking about his new business, Nedden, artisanal coffee shop. He said he just needed a small push to get started. I remember the way Mom's eyes sparkled with pride, calling him a visionary. He didn't ask me directly. He didn't have to. Mom did it for him. You're doing so well, Ivy. Could you maybe help your brother get started? I hesitated. She added softly, it's family. And that's how it began, the slow bleed. The coffee shop lasted 8 months. Suppliers cut him off. Mom called crying. I wired $28,000 from my emergency fund. Gage texted, thanks, bro. Yes, bro, and disappeared again. I told myself it was fine, just one time. I still had the condo payments running, everything under control, except it wasn't under control. Because when you start saving people from the consequences of their own choices, they stop learning to stand. A year passed. Gage's business failed. The condo survived. And me? I was still eating noodles in the same studio apartment, telling myself it was temporary. Every time I saw my parents smile, I felt a rush of warmth, like I was doing something noble, like their happiness justified my exhaustion. I didn't know then that the gratitude was already gone, that to them, my help wasn't a blessing anymore. It was an obligation. And the more I gave, the more invisible I became. By the second year, the $3,800 transfer had become as routine as brushing my teeth. I didn't even check the balance anymore. It just went, quietly, automatically, like a heartbeat I no longer controlled. Every first of the month, I'd open my laptop, glance at the confirmation screen, and whisper, "Okay, done." Then I'd go back to drafting 3D renderings, eating takeout noodles, pretending everything was fine. My parents didn't ask if it was still manageable. They didn't ask if I needed help with my own bills. They just assumed. The condo became less a shared memory and more a burden I carried alone. And yet I kept doing it, because I thought being the responsible one was my identity. If I stopped, who was I then? One afternoon, about 18 months in, Mom called crying again. My stomach dropped. I'd learned that tone meant one thing: money. "Ivy," she sniffled, "it's Gage. He's trying so hard, but the coffee shop's in trouble. His suppliers are threatening to sue him for late payments. He owes $28,000. If we don't help him, he'll lose everything." Everything? He was 29, selling lattes out of a half-renovated storefront with no business plan. Still, I swallowed my frustration. "What about the loan I already gave him to start it?" She hesitated. "That's different. This is to save it." I should have said no, but I heard Dad in the background saying, "He's your brother, Ivy." So I wired the $28,000 from my emergency fund, the one I'd built for equipment upgrades and maybe someday a down payment on my own place. When I texted Gage to confirm he'd gotten it, he replied with one word: "Thanks, bro. Not thank you. Not I'll pay you back. Just bro." That night I stared at the ceiling until sunrise, wondering when my life had turned into financing other people's mistakes. The next few months passed in silence, until Gage's next emergency. His truck broke down. He needed a vehicle to make deliveries. The shop was already dead, but apparently the dream wasn't. Mom and Dad showed up at my apartment, unannounced, holding dealership papers. "Just cosign," Mom said gently. "It's only for a used sedan. He'll make the payments." I looked at the contract, my credit on the line, my signature binding me if he failed. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder. "He just needs a little faith, Ivy." Faith, that word used to mean something. I signed. 6 months later, the first missed payment notice hit my inbox. Then another, and another. Each time, Gage swore he'd handle it. Each time, he didn't. My credit score started to bleed points. I could almost hear the ding echoing in my skull. Meanwhile, on social media, Gage posted pictures from weekend road trips with his new girlfriend, now fiancée, captioned, "Chasing dreams and sunsets." I wanted to comment, "You're chasing them with my credit, idiot." But I didn't, because nice daughters don't make scenes. At the next family dinner, I brought it up gently. "Gage's car payments are still under my name. If he misses again, I'll have to cover them." Mom's smile faltered. "He's doing his best, Ivy. You've always been so lucky with money. Can't you give him time?" Lucky. That word hit like a slap. I wasn't lucky. I worked 12-hour days. I hadn't taken a real vacation in years. I lived off coffee and deadlines so they could live comfortably. But in their eyes, my sacrifices weren't effort. They were entitlement, proof I could handle more. When Gage got married a few months later, I wasn't even invited to the small family-only ceremony. I saw photos online. My mom glowing, my dad laughing, Gage kissing his new wife, Kayla. They all looked happy. No one mentioned the woman paying for the roof over their heads or the car in their driveway. When I called Mom, half hoping for some acknowledgement, she said, "Oh, honey, it was last minute. We didn't want to burden you." Burden me, as if I wasn't already carrying them all. The resentment started small, a quiet ache in the chest. But with every skipped thank you, every silent assumption, it grew heavier. By year 4, the 3,800 transfers were background noise. My income had grown, but so had my exhaustion. I'd stopped buying new clothes, stopped eating out, stopped dreaming about my own house. When colleagues teased me for being cheap, I laughed. When they asked if I was saving for something, I said, sort of. But the truth was I wasn't saving. I was bleeding. And still I couldn't stop, because I was terrified that if I pulled away, they'd all fall apart, and I'd be the villain. That's how they trained me without ever saying it. Be generous or you're selfish. Be helpful or you're cruel. Be quiet or you're ungrateful. By the 5th year, something in me had started to crack. Mom called one night, not to ask, but to demand. The tone was different, sharper. You know the transfer's late, right? It wasn't. I just delayed it by a day because of a client payment lag. I wanted to scream, "You could say thank you," but instead I said, "It's processing." She sighed, exasperated. "Well, just make sure it doesn't happen again. It worries your father." That was the moment I realized they weren't worried about me, just their convenience. I hung up, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time the thought crossed my mind. What if I just stopped? It felt dangerous, liberating, unthinkable. But I didn't do it. Not yet. I wasn't ready. That would come later, with one text, 6 words, and the coldest silence I'd ever known. By the 6th year, the routine had become mechanical. Money out, silence in. Every first of the month, I'd glance at my account, see the transfer confirmation, and tell myself, at least they're okay. But somewhere deep down, I wasn't. I was 34 years old and still living in the same studio apartment I'd rented at 28. My friends were buying homes, traveling to Europe, starting families. I was stuck between invoices and guilt, designing dream spaces for clients while I couldn't even afford a second bedroom. And still every Sunday I drove to my parents' condo for dinner. It was my habit, my ritual. I brought groceries, cooked most of the meal, and listened to Gage talk about his next business opportunity. This time it was coffee trucks, because apparently if one coffee shop failed, you just put it on wheels and call it innovation. Mom laughed at every word he said, pride glowing in her eyes. "He's such a visionary, isn't he?" I smiled tightly. "Visionary, sure." Gage grinned at me. "You could invest, you know, just a little startup capital to get it rolling." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "I think I've invested enough in your ideas already." The room went quiet. Mom's smile dropped. "There's no need to be rude, Ivy." "I'm not being rude," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just can't keep funding things that don't exist." Dad cleared his throat. "You've always been so ungrateful lately." Ungrateful, that word again, the one they always used to twist the knife. I looked around the table, the furniture I'd paid for, the roof I'd saved, the food I'd brought. And somehow, I was the ungrateful one. That night I drove home in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Something inside me felt different, brittle, like glass ready to shatter. The next morning my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Is that all your ability amounts to? Stop embarrassing us." No greeting, no context, just that. I read it once, then again. I waited for a second message, a clarification, maybe even an apology, but nothing came. The words sat there, sharp and heavy. For a long moment, I just stared at them, feeling something in my chest cave in and collapse. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to make them proud, all the things I'd given up, the vacations, the dates I canceled, the projects I turned down. And this was what I got in return. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have typed paragraphs. I could have begged, explained, defended. Instead, I typed one word, noted, and I hit send. Then, without hesitation, I opened my banking app, Tap. I scrolled to the automatic transfer labeled Harper condo, the one I'd been feeding for 6 years, and I pressed cancel. The confirmation screen popped up. "Are you sure you want to stop this recurring payment?" I was sure. I pressed yes. It was quiet, just the faint hum of my laptop fan. But in that silence, something enormous shifted. The guilt, the obligation, the endless weight. It lifted. For the first time in years, I felt air in my lungs that wasn't thick with shame. I made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched snow fall over Southbend. The world didn't end. My parents didn't call. Nothing exploded. until 48 hours later. The first missed call came at 9:13 a.m. Unknown number, then again at 9:15. I let it ring. A few minutes later, a voicemail notification blinked across my screen. "Ms. Harper, this is Quincy, your parents' attorney. We have an urgent matter. Please call back immediately." His voice trembled. He sounded terrified. I replayed it twice, heart steady, breath even. Urgent matter, lawyer voice, fear. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time in weeks. They'd finally realized what it felt like to panic. The irony hit me all at once. I'd been holding up their lives like scaffolding, and the moment I stepped away, it all came crashing down. I didn't call him back. Not yet. I wanted them to feel it. The weight of responsibility, the silence I'd lived under for years. Hours passed. More calls, more messages. "Please, Ivy, call us." I ignored them all. That night, as the snow piled higher outside, I poured myself a glass of cheap red wine and opened my old sketchbook, the one I hadn't touched since college. I drew a line down the center of the page. Straight, clean, sharp. On one side, I wrote everything I've given. On the other, everything they've taken. And for the first time in 6 years, the scales tipped toward me. The next morning, I finally called the lawyer back. My voice was calm. "This is Ivy Harper returning your call. You said it was urgent?" He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. "Ms. Harper, your parents, they've been refinancing the condo multiple times under your credit." I went completely still. "Excuse me?" He hesitated. "They added your name to the property years ago for loan approval, but there have been several additional mortgages signed under your information. We just discovered discrepancies." I closed my eyes. My own parents had forged my name. 6 years of loyalty, 6 years of sacrifice, and they'd been quietly using my credit, my future, to prop up their lives. I didn't say anything. Not right away. I just whispered, "I see." Quincy's voice shook. "You need to come in, Ms. Harper. Today, if possible." I hung up and sat there in the quiet, feeling the last piece of my old life crumble. They hadn't just taken my money. They'd taken my trust, my identity, my name. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about war. I don't remember the drive to Quincy's office. One minute I was staring at the phone. The next I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room surrounded by stacks of paper, each stamped with my forged signature. Every loop, every curve of the pen, perfect copies of my handwriting. My mother's hand had always been steady. She'd helped me fill out forms when I was a teenager. She knew exactly how I signed my name. Quincy adjusted his glasses. "We found 5 separate refinances over the past 6 years, each one approved under your name as co-signer. The debt totals about $760,000. I blinked once, twice. "What happens now?" He looked at me cautiously. "If you press charges, it's criminal fraud. But they're your parents, Ms. Harper. They're your parents." That sentence had always been the excuse, the leash, the thing that kept me obedient. I stared down at the papers again. The pages didn't just show their signatures. They showed their contempt, their certainty that I'd never fight back. "They've used me," I said quietly. "They've stolen from me, over and over." Quincy nodded. "You're well within your rights to pursue legal action, but it will destroy them." I leaned back in my chair. Maybe it's time something destroyed them. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my apartment with every document spread around me, the evidence of 6 years of betrayal forming a paper graveyard. Somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., I stopped crying. I felt hollow, calm, almost surgical. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The first step was practical. I contacted every lender, every bureau, every bank that had my forged signature on file. I sent notarized affidavits and copies of my ID. I froze my credit. I filed the fraud report. The second step was colder. I drafted an email to my parents. It had no greeting, no emotion, just the facts. "I know what you did. The refinancing, the forged documents, the use of my credit. I've reported everything. The banks have copies of your signatures. There will be an investigation. Do not contact me again." I hovered over send for a long moment, then clicked it. For the first time, I felt free. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just free. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Quincy. Inside was a notice from the bank. Foreclosure proceedings had begun on my parents' condo. The gilded facade, the home I'd saved again and again, was now collapsing under the weight of their lies. I didn't go to the hearing, but Gage did. He called me afterward, his voice shaking. "How could you do this to them?" he spat. "They're losing everything." I waited a beat, then said, "So did I." He went silent. "I lost 6 years, Gage. 6 years paying for your failures. 6 years covering their debts. They forged my name." He started to protest, but I hung up before he could. I'd spent too long explaining myself to people who only listened when money was involved. A month later, I got a message from a mutual friend. My parents had moved into a small rental on the outskirts of town. No savings, no business, no status. They were finally living the life they'd always mocked. Ordinary, quiet, humble. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance, like I was watching a storm recede over the horizon, leaving broken branches and silence in its wake. Spring came. I accepted a new job offer in Chicago, creative director for a boutique design firm. Twice my old salary, my own team, my own space. The day I packed, I found the sketchbook from that night, the one with the line down the middle. I turned the page, drew another line, and wrote in clean block letters, "Everything I've built." Underneath, I listed each new beginning, my own apartment, my own career, my own peace. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, I got one last message. It was from my mother, just 4 words. "We didn't mean to." I stared at it for a long time. Then slowly I typed my reply. "I know, that's why it's worse." And I hit send. In the years that followed, people sometimes asked why I'd never reconciled, never visited, never looked back. I told them the truth. Some debts are financial, some are emotional, and some, the kind that drain your soul, can only be repaid by walking away. So I did, and every time I passed a window filled with light and laughter, I thought of that condo I'd once saved, and the people who'd lived. There, like royalty on borrowed grace. Now the only place I save anymore is myself.